So I thought we'd have a discussion today about what is history. There's a difference between history and the past. History is what we write about the past, and I always tell people that all history is revisionist history because although what the facts of the past are usually don't change unless we discover new facts, but our perspectives of those facts do. And so we're always looking at it a little bit differently each time we go. And we need to note that statues are not history, and buildings are not history. History is, again, what we write about the past. And so when people say things like, well, we're erasing our history, we're not. If we're taking down a statue, we're not erasing history. There used to be statues of King George, and we took those down and melted them into bullets used in the fight the American Revolution. Too often, what people think is history is really mythology. They believed in some mythological version of American history. And so my advice is to you is to read history, read primary source documents, read interpretation of those documents. If you watch a movie that's based on a historical event, remember it's based on it. And the good thing about a movie might be is that it will spark your interest in learning more about what actually happened. And so you'll watch a movie, and of course they've dramatized it. And then when you go back and you read it, and you go, well, that's not what happened. It doesn't make the movie any less enjoyable, but it did spark your interest. And so my advice is to read history. Read history as much as you can. Go back and read primary source documents. And when we say primary source documents, we're talking about letters, documents, deeds, often diaries, all those kind of things that you can go back and read and learn about what was going on in the past. And I think one of the things that you note when you study that past is that some of the issues that we struggle with today, they struggled with back then. Now, I'm also not a real big fan of the old saying, those who forget the past are condemned to repeat it, and we have to learn from the past. That's also difficult because, for example, if you take Vietnam, did we learn the lessons from Vietnam? Well, what are the lessons from Vietnam? We can dispute that constantly. Are those lessons applicable to, say, the Middle East? Are they applicable to Africa? So you can't take one event and just apply it anywhere around the world, or even sure about what was the proper lesson that you learned, or lessons, we could say several, that came out of that event. Too often we think about the Munich Analogy. If you remember that Hitler wanted part of Czechoslovakia, Chamberlain and the French gave him that part of Czechoslovakia in Munich, and to appease Hitler and hoping that appeasement would stop him from expanding. And of course it didn't. And he expanded further when we got into World War II. That became known as the Munich Analogy. And the Munich Analogy is that you can never try to appease a dictator because they'll always want more. Well, appeasement was a very popular notion at the time. Chamberlain was quite the hero with the policy of appeasement, especially after the devastating impact of World War I. But you still do appeasement today. You try to find ways to get through conflict without having people dying. And so we may not use the word appeasement, but we still follow that Munich Analogy. Often we've seen it with Iraq and other places where you see leaders going, we have learned that dictators, if you appease them, they'll want more. And that may be true, but we got to make sure that we don't always apply a hard and fast rule to every situation. So history, it's writing about the past. History is revisionist. It's always revisionist as we get different perspectives and we learn more. And make sure that you never read history backwards. And we often do that. We go, well, the Battle of Gettysburg was the turning point. Well, no one knew that at the time. You can't make those decisions. Or they'll say, well, the Confederacy never had a chance. Well, they certainly thought they had a chance. You're looking at it backwards. So read history, enjoy history. It's a lot of fun, a lot of things you can learn. Find history of not just famous people, but the everyday person, the carpenter, the slave in the United States. It's a little bit more difficult looking for women's history further in the past because they weren't allowed to to do the things that men were able to do. But it is out there and you should find it. So go out and learn history, challenge yourself, and don't just buy into a mythology of history that too often we see in our elected leaders or in the general public.